I enlisted before I was even registered for the draft. I was too young to be registered for the draft yet. So I asked my mother to let me join the Army. And I was an only son. And she said, this is the most difficult thing I've ever done in my life, but I'm going to do it because if I was a young man, I would do exactly the same thing.
So how old were you then when your mother let you enlist in the Army?
I was just before my 18th birthday. I'd already graduated I just graduated from high school, and I'd gone to college 1 year, 1 semester. But I was afraid the war would be over before I got there. I was
Where were you
wrong.
living at that time?
At that time, we were living in Waco, Texas, because we had moved from up in the Panhandle to Waco because my mother got the job with the Veterans Administration, and the statewide office for the Veterans Administration at that time was in Waco, because this was before World War II, so there wasn't that many veterans around. So they just had the one office in Texas.
Why did you pick the Army?
Well, what happened? I went and talked to an old recruiting sergeant. They had an office in Waco, and I told him, I wanted to join the Army, and so he said, "What unit would you like to be in?" I said, "I want to be in a combat unit. I want to be in a unit that's going to fight." And he said, and so he said, "What do you want to do?" And I said, "Well, I guess the infantry, they fight." No, he said, you can take anything you want. At this time, we have a rule that if you join, you can pick what organization you want to be in the service. He said, they will take everybody in the infantry, So what you need to do, but I said, I want to make sure it's a combat unit. He said, well, the Armored Force is a brand new organization. Armored Force is and the guy who's organizing it at this point is General Patton. And he's trying to make it a separate unit in the service, not even be in the Army, to be called the Armored Force. They're going to have fancy uniforms and all that, because Patton loved uniforms. And he said, it sounded good, so I said, okay, that's what I'll go. So they sent me to Fort Knox, Kentucky. That was the home of the armor at that time.
And
that's where I took my basic training.
How long was basic training?
Oh, 4 or 5 months, I would say, 4 or 5 months.
And then, so was that basic training for Army, or did they actually do basic training for the Armored Force?
No, it was the Armored Force, because that was the home of the Armored Force at that time.
What kinds of things did they train you in?
It was like basic training for any of the combat services, and then they especially give you training on the armored vehicles and all that sort of thing.
Which armored vehicles did you learn to operate?
All of them. They let you drive.
They teach you everything, and then later on
you go to, because they don't know exactly what you're going to do. And then when you finish the basic, then they sent me to the 3rd Armored Division, which at that time was based in Indiantown Gap, Pennsylvania. That's where I went and joined it.
Do you recall what year you joined the Army?
Let's see, what year? It was right after, very shortly after Pearl Harbor. Yeah.
I think I actually saw some of your paperwork. I think it was 1942.
Yeah, that's probably right.
At the 3rd Armored Division in Pennsylvania, did you have more training there?
Well, see, they assigned me to my unit. So I joined the 3rd Battalion of the 32nd Armored Regiment. And yeah, we had all kind of training, but when we got up there, we'd already been pretty well trained. And when we got up there, it was like it gets in Pennsylvania, it was really cold, And we didn't stay long until we moved from there to the port and got on the ships and went to England.
Oh, so you didn't stay long in
Not long.
Pennsylvania for
I
training.
don't know. It was a few
Basically-
months. I don't remember exactly the length.
And what unit did they put you in?
The headquarters of the 3rd Battalion of the 32nd Armored Regiment
Did you stay with that unit for the entire war?
for the entire war. That's right. And it had the same commander,
And who was that?
General Walter B. Richardson. At that time, he was a lieutenant colonel. And he was the battalion commander. And I think he stayed as battalion commander all the way through the war. And then when the war was over, he began to get. He stayed in the army. And as time went on, I finally ended up in Thailand and Laos. And in Laos, I had an office out near the airport. We were arming the moon, we were beginning to run the moon operation, but we had 2 Caribou aircraft, which were brand new aircraft for the Army was wanting to use these Caribous because they could land and take off very short, but they were big airplanes. They could haul a lot of people, equipment, everything else, called the Caribou great airplane. And so they sent 2 to Air America to test them. We flew them all over. So they said, this general is coming, we got this general in town, he's coming out to see you. He wants to talk about the Caribou. Okay, he showed up, he walked in, it was my old battalion commander from World War II.
Holy cow.
But he didn't know I was there. And I had
Did you recognize him, right?
Oh, I recognized him immediately. He claimed he recognized me. I don't believe it. But anyway, he claimed he recognized me. So, we talked about the Caribou, but then we talked about
World War II.
About World War II. It was I really enjoyed seeing him. But by that time, he was a major general. And then later, after the Vietnam War got started and all that, in the end, the last guy who commanded the army in Vietnam, and then he became the overall army commander. What the hell was his name? General Abrams. He was a friend of just General Chand, who was a police general that I knew very well. I worked with him all the time, border police, and he went to staff and command school at Fort Knox, wherever it was in the U.S., in the same class with General Abrams. And they had become friends, right?
Richardson and Abrams?
No, this wasn't Richardson. No,
Oh.
This was a Thai general.
Oh.
And as I say, then he invited me to lunch one day when he also invited General Abrams because he was in Bangkok visiting his family lived in Bangkok, but he was the commander in Vietnam.
Wow.
So I met him, and of course I remembered him because in World War II, the 2 most famous combat commanders were General Richardson and General Abrams. They were friends.
And isn't that strange? You'd find them both years later in the Vietnam conflict.
Yeah, and
when your armored division left Pennsylvania, where did you go to?
we went straight to the port and got on the
What port?
ship, New York.
And you left out of New York?
We left out of New York. We sailed right by the Statue of Liberty.
And where did you go?
Went to England. And you wonder when we sail by, I'll never forget that thing. I hope I get to see that again one day.
The Statue of Liberty?
When we sail back.
And as it turned out, you did. Where did you land in England?
At Southampton. See, what we did is because they were having the biggest attacks of the German subs that they ever had during the war, during that period of time. So we went over with what they said was the largest convoy that ever crossed from the U.S. to England.
Wow.
I mean, in every direction you could see. They put a good distance between all the ships, but in every direction, all you could see was the ships. But they were far away from each other. And every once in a while, the German subs would come in and sink a ship. You'd hear the explosion, and see the thing on fire. And then all the sub chasers would be running in these little sub chasers trying to get the, but the convoy kept moving right on. And we sailed all the way up and went along the coast of Greenland and went way to the north, and then came, when we got to the British Isles, we came down from the north between Ireland and England to Southampton, trying to, avoid the submarines.
And where did you stay in Southampton? Then.
Well, no, as soon as we landed in Southampton, we got on the train and went to a little town of Codford, England. Codford, Codford, I believe it's spelled. Small, real small village type thing. But it was on what they call the Salisbury Plain, which means it was a plain, and it was where the British had always trained the armored units. So we stayed there then for several months before the Normandy invasion.
What did you do during the time you stayed there?
We trained. It was through that winter, and the British winters, there's not a lot of snow or anything. You get a little snow maybe, but not a lot, but they're all just cold and damp. I don't think I was ever warm in that whole period of time. And we stayed in the Quatchint hut where there was really no heat. And it was a pretty uncomfortable winter.
Do you remember any of your instructors or your trainers?
Not really. Because I'd gone through so many different training. I trained with basic training at Fort Knox, and then I was then I joined the actual division. So we trained, but the colonel was in charge of all of the training. Walter B. Richardson was mine.
Now, when you were at Codford, did you specialized in an armored vehicle yet, or were you still?
Oh no! I'd already had all kind of training. I was in the headquarters company, 3rd Battalion, 32nd Armored Regiment, and I was in the mortar platoon. And we had 81 millimeter mortars mounted in half track. You know what a half track is?
Can you explain that?
On what the half track?
Yes.
Well, a half track it has armor all around, but it's open top. But it has armor, and it has 2 front wheels, and then it has tracks in the back. Tracks in the back of it. And the tracks, you can put grommets on there to get through any kind of mud and stuff like that. And the mortar is mounted in the half track, but you can take the mortar out very easily. Because
so you can either use it mounted in the half track, or you can just use it.
Take it out on the ground. And people don't know that, but one of the most important weapons, and it still is today, is the 81 millimeter mortar, because you can carry it. You break it into 3 pieces. 3 guys can carry it. You can put it anywhere, but it fires a good sized shell, with a tail like a little bomb. And you drop the shell in, and it fires and goes back out. And it's very accurate. You can hit things within. I think the limit was probably a little over 3,000 yards. And you can fire high explosive or smoke. The big thing we fired was smoke, because with the smoke shells, you can set up a smoke screen. So when we moved into combat, we always drove down a road somewhere and drove as fast as you could go straight on down. And in the lead, you always had 2 tanks. And behind those 2 tanks was a mortar half track. And the infantry usually rode on the back of the tanks until you got into a fight. But what our job was, that when a German anti-tank gun of any kind, or a German tank would take a shot at the tanks in the lead, our job was to immediately fire smoke shells. We we watched the wind all the time. So if the shell came from over here and the wind was blowing this way, you lay a smoke round right here and it immediately blinds that guy so he can't see you anymore. And so that's why you can prevent your tanks from getting knocked out. That's why they have the mortar half-track right up behind the two lead tanks.
Now, your job as part of that half-track team was to fire the mortar. Did you also have to learn how to drive the half-track?
Yeah, well, you had to learn to drive every vehicle in the, in our battalion, the headquarters company, which we were in. We were one in the headquarters company, and you had the mortar platoon, and you also had the recon platoon, and in the recon platoon you had a couple of light tanks. You had the half tracks that could carry the combat soldiers, a couple of half tracks, so you could make up a regular task force like right out of the battalion. And our job was always to follow the two lead tanks. So when an anti-tank outfit opened up tanks or whatever it was, is to get a smoke screen out there to blind them so they couldn't knock out our tanks.
How many men did it take to man one half-track mortar?
I think our total was about six guys.
And what was your job in that team of 6 guys?
I was the assistant gunner. I dropped the shell down the tube at first. Then I became everything after that. But initially, that's what I was.
You learned it as an assistant gunner? All right, so then after months of training in England, where did you go then?
Well, the next thing you did is we moved. I mean, you knew you were getting close to when they're going to invade. There's no question about that.
How much knowledge did you have of the exact invasion? Did you guys know what you were going to do?
Well, we knew that everybody knew that it was coming, but nobody knew the detail, and I certainly didn't. Just being a kid enlisted man, they never consulted me on the tactics. Although I was probably smarter than most of them, because I was very bright, had good education, and all. And so, the first thing we did is we moved from Codford to what they call a staging area. And that was just a place where you could park and stay. And what we were doing is waiting to get on the LST, landing ship tank, because that's what we were going to cross the channel on. But when we were in this staging area, nobody knew exactly when the invasion was going to take place. But the first wave that went and hit the beach in Normandy, there was no armored units in it. That would have been, in order to land an armored division, you've got to have enough of a beach that you can get ashore and get the waterproofing off the vehicles. You have to waterproof, because when you go off of the LST, I mean, you may drive through some deep water that comes right up over the engine and everything else, so you have to have it waterproofed.
How do you waterproof it?
It's a compound, and I think they have a lot of asbestos and stuff in that compound, but it's like a gooey compound, and you put it over everything where you don't want the water to go. All your electrical connections.
Then how do you remove it when you get on shore?
Well, that's what you've got to have time to remove it, and then you just pull it off. It's like it's a mass that you can just mold around all the electrical fixtures, everything like that. So when you drive into the water, even the water comes up over the engine, it still runs all right. But then what you have to do is to get ashore and have enough time to get the waterproofing off. Because if you don't take the waterproofing off, I mean, it'll immediately heat up. And you're not going to be in business very long unless you get the waterproofing off. So that's why we did not land on D-Day, because you had to wait until there was enough beach to get ashore and get the waterproofing off. So I don't know exactly what day it was, because nobody ever told me what day it was. And you don't keep up with it when you're in that staging area. There's ships everywhere, confusing every place. Now, I remember the night the invasion actually took place, because we were in this staging area in England. And, all of a sudden I woke up and there was clouds of airplanes going over, heading straight for the Normandy. So that was planes with the paratroopers and all that they dropped in.
And then did you just figure it out on your own, or did they tell you that this was the big invasion?
No, they didn't tell us, but you knew it was, because you knew what I mean. So and then we got on to the LSTs and went and drove and went right over there. But we waited on the LSTs for a while to find, because what they needed to do was to have a beach that you could land on and get the waterproofing off before you were fired on. Because you had to do that or you couldn't do anything otherwise. So then when we came up and you had to wait, they had you go in as far as you could when the tide was all the way in, and you actually hit the beach, and they dropped the door in front, but then you waited until the tide ran out. You hit it at the time when the tide was at the highest. So when the tide ran out, then the water wasn't too deep to drive through it with those vehicles.
What beach did your unit land on?
Omaha.
What was it like when you landed?
Well, you could look up and down each way down that beach. As far as you could see were the masts of ships. I mean, it was just unbelievable. As far as your eye could see in both directions, you could see the mast of the ships. So no telling, I don't know how many men they landed in that period of time, but they were just landing everywhere. So when we pulled up there, we stopped, and what they were waiting is waiting for the tide to be at the highest, and then we're going to hit the beach and let the tide run out. So the Navy ran the ship, so they fed us there. They gave us food to eat before we went out. But I remember because my mess kit, and I picked up the food, was walking along the rail, and I looked down there, and there was a dead American sergeant floating by me, upside down, and he still had on his steel helmet and all. And that was the first realize that you're in a real battle here.
What were you thinking after that? You realized the seriousness of...
Oh, yeah. But at the same time, I wouldn't have wanted to be anywhere else. Because I was a very adventuresome guy. And, you realize when you think there has never and will never be another military operation like this. It's absolutely the biggest ever, and there will never be another one that big.
And did you realize that at the time?
Oh, I thought it at the time. And then you look back on it now. I mean, there's no question, it's still the greatest military operation that ever occurred. And I think General Eisenhower was a real military genius, because he planned all of that. That was because when you landed, everything you needed was right there. And as you went on and went across Germany and all that, all the trucks started running and bringing because it was all supplied off of that beach all the way until you got to met the Russians on the Elbe River. It was all supplied from that beach. Constant convoys of trucks, one after the other, hauling the stuff. And we moved so fast that when we got into Belgium, almost into Germany, we were almost ready to cross. I think maybe we had crossed the German border, and we ran out of everything. No gasoline, no anything, because the trucks, just couldn't keep up. So eventually they came in with aircraft, and they dropped barrels of fuel that we could put in the vehicles, barrels, and then you pumped them into all the vehicles.
When the tide went out and it was time to unload onto Omaha Beach, where were you? Were you in your half track?
No. I was up in the front, was looking. biggest show you could possibly ever see. And I didn't realize that they were starting to go out, and I looked, and then I started running like crazy because my half track was getting ready to go off. So I just, as it went off, I jumped and grabbed the back and climbed. We were already in the water.
Almost went on without you when you were busy watching it.
Oh, if I hadn't caught up with it, I don't know how I would have caught it.
Well,
I knew my unit and all, so I eventually.
Did each half track have a number or a name or anything?
I didn't see any number or anything.
Your crew always stayed
you
with
knew
the same
unit,
vehicle,
and
though?
you knew the unit. Oh yeah.
So you always had the same half track?
We sat right there in that half track for the whole war.
Were you with your same crew?
Yeah.
So it was all you same guys through the whole thing.
And we had a charmed life. I think there's no question about it. We took heavy casualties in the whole unit and all that, but we never had a single man in our half track even wounded. And we were in combat almost constantly. But the reason why we never got wounded or killed is because we educated ourselves in a hell of a big hurry. So, okay, you fire the mortar. That's what you got to be able to do anytime is to fire the mortar. But a mortar shoots a very high trajectory shell, right? So the first thing you want to do is make sure you're behind something, because you can fire over trees, over anything, and then you get an observer out so he can make the adjustments to make sure you're on target, right? But because you're always behind something, they can't shoot you. And so you got to be good at that. You got to make sure you can do that. The ones who don't get killed. And I think in my half track, we became really good at that. And that's why we lived through it. And after we had landed in Normandy, we went up into what they call the hedgerows, which is right off of because when we went to Normandy last year, I drove into the hedgerow country, and I saw because when you pulled up to those hedgerows, they were about head high of a big pile of earth, right? And then trees growing on top of that. And they formed little fields, and there was a gate somewhere going into each individual field, but they didn't need a fence. Because, you had, cattle and stuff but all you need was a gate. At that point, the cattle couldn't get out, but they're not very big. Okay, so when we drove on up a ways and we stopped, we're already in the hedgerows, right? And, like in many cases, you don't know what's going on. We're just sitting on the road there. So then a call came back from probably the battalion headquarters. Something said that you should send 2 or 3 guys out over the first hedgerow, or maybe the second hedgerow, and so that you're not surprised by Germans could come over those hedgerows and attack you from the side, because nobody knew where they were. So, so the 3 of us went over a couple of hedgerows, and one of them was our squad leader, who was his parents had come from Germany. He was born in the U.S., Sheboygan, Wisconsin. But, of course, he learned German at home, because his parents, when he was born, the parents couldn't speak English, so he learned German at home. But he even spoke English like anybody. But it was very fortunate for us that you had him there. So we went over a couple of hedgerows, and we were waiting, and all of a sudden we could hear voices. And you got to listen carefully, and it wasn't English they were speaking, So there were 3 of us in, Sergeant Herman and me and another guy, and we went up, and we had a place where we could look over into the next hedgerow, over to the next hedgerow. All of a sudden, a German soldier came over that hedgerow, and he had his rifle. He dropped down, started sneaking down with a rifle, and Sergeant Herman yelled at him and told him to put up his hands. He immediately dropped his rifle, threw up his hands, and said, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," because he, and of course Herman, fortunately, could understand it. And Sherman said, "Okay, you tell your friends," because we knew there were others over there, to come over the hedgerow, leave their weapons behind, come over that hedge. And we were still over on this hedgerow, right? So they all came over, and it turned out to be a whole German infantry platoon, 35 people.
So your first day on the beach,
Yeah, they came over to that hedgerow. They dropped all their weapons. They left them, and then we had
three guys, just you three.
Yeah,
guys?
and then we had them come over to this hedgerow where we were right behind it, right? And there was a place there where you could come through the trees on the hedgerow, top of the hedgerow. So Herman was down there talking to them. So we had them come over, and as they came over, we told them to drop their weapons, and then we searched to make sure they didn't have some weapon with them. And the lieutenant came over, and he had a pistol. He still had his pistol in a holster. I took the pistol and kept it, and eventually brought it home with me. I still have that.
Wow.
That pistol, one of my prized possessions. But then when we went back to the road where the unit was all sitting, we came walking in with 35 German prisoners.
What a surprise. And then what do you do with them?
Then you feel like Sergeant York or something. See? No, what happens is you just call the military police, and they'll send a unit up there and pick the prisoners up and take them to wherever they put them. Now
that was a pretty eventful first day on the job.
Oh, it was. But it's that kind of thing that makes the unit. You become sure that you can do something, and then you begin to believe that you can take care of yourself. And the more you believe that, pretty soon you really can take care of yourself. And I think that's why we never got anybody killed, because you're firing a mortar, you fire over the something. So always when you set up and you know you're going to be firing, make sure you get behind trees, a building, something, so they can't shoot you. And we were so good at it, I think that's why we survived. Because my platoon, we never had anybody killed or wounded.
Did you have casualties in your unit, though?
Oh yeah, in the other units, we had the 32nd Armored Regiment had more casualties than any armored division in World War II. There were a lot of casualties, but I think the reason we survived is because we learned very quickly and became very proficient at what we were doing.
How long did you stay between Omaha Beach and the hedgerows?
Oh, we went right over when we landed, we went up to the top of the ridge, and when I went to Normandy last year, I could see exactly where we landed, and where we went up to the top, and then I drove up to the hedgerow. And what we did is I right to the hedgerow where those Germans had come over. It still looks exactly the same.
Really? And then you continued inland?
Well, then what we did there, we waited there for a good while, and then we didn't. Of course, you never know if you're an enlisted man, and even the lieutenants, they don't know what the hell's going on or what's going to happen next. So we were sitting there, and eventually we just waited there, and we brought in a lot of other stuff, so we had lots of stuff there, and then eventually, it's probably the next day or so, I think we may have stayed as much as 2 days, just sat on the road. And then all of a sudden they came in with an order that said they had us go up to this certain place, and then all of a sudden then they came over with airplanes, and as far as you could see, it was just wave after wave. I think there were 3 waves. First wave was the big bombers, and they said it was a mile wide, I think a mile, or maybe a little over a mile. The big bombers came over, they dropped all their stuff, and then the fighter bombers came over and dropped their stuff, and then the next group was fighters, and they hit individual targets, and we were all waiting in a line. And as soon as they stopped all of that, then we jumped off and tried, because what they believed that they would have killed most of the Germans who were in front of you. Certainly wasn't all of them. And then we were going to attack right through that, and what it was called the St. Lo breakthrough. St. Lo was the big town there, so we drove through that, and once we got through that, picked up a few shots at us and all, but we basically drove through, and then we started driving. It was kind of parallel to the ocean, but going into France. And we drove all day, just about all day. You know, you were driving at highway speeds right down that road. And when you'd come into little towns, sometimes you'd stop because something was going on. The Germans had no idea you were anywhere in the area. I'll never forget, we stopped at this one crossroad, and all of a sudden this German soldier came out from the side road on a bicycle. He was in, and as soon as he saw us, they had no idea we were anywhere close. Man, you talking about somebody pedaling. He was flat pedaling that bicycle and went on across and kept going.
Why didn't they know that you were?
No way they could know, because we had driven so fast. They didn't know where we were. So what it was, we drove, it was called the Falais Gap. I mean, what they did is they had, on our side, we were going down one side, and I think the British were in there somewhere, but they were going down on the other side, and we were supposed to drive down and try to surround the Germans who were fighting against us. They wanted to surround it, but they didn't want to close the gap. It was called the Falais Gap. You can see it in all the history books.
Yep.
And then as the Germans broke through, they'd go through that hole, and you could knock out most of the vehicles with air and with the ground fire and all that. Of course, you didn't get all of them, but you got an awful lot of them. And I think the Germans had already decided that they were going to fight their way back to the Siegfried Line in Germany. So we drove on across France, and there was a lot of fighting, but I think basically the Germans had already decided to give that whole area up and go back to the Siegfried Line. So what I think became our task to try to beat the Germans to the Siegfried Line. And we basically did it. We went right into the Siegfried Line. Then we stayed that night in the pillboxes. And we're right there. The German Siegfried Line is a big line. It has pillboxes where you can get out of any kind of shooting.
So you just kept driving straight and as fast as you could through.
Oh, we had individual fights along the way.
How many days did it take you to get from Omaha to the Siegfried Line?
I don't really remember. It's a certain amount of time. You know, it wasn't that. So I don't know exactly.
Well, are we talking like days or weeks?
It's probably a few weeks, I would guess. Yeah, because we went, when we landed, it was pretty much spring. By the time we got to the Siegfried Line, it was later in the, and what happened when you got that far, you had traveled so fast that your vehicles were all wearing out, I mean, and the one other thing, we had outrun all the supplies, so you didn't have any gasoline.
Oh,
so they even
half track wasn't going to go.
Well, half track, tanks, everything.
But you did make it to the Siegfried Line.
Eventually, but they started dropping. They started dropping gas in barrels with parachutes, and you had pumps, so you could just pump it into the vehicles, and we just kept going as much as you could. And you had battles.
Can you recall any of the battles in the places along the way?
Not really. I don't remember the names. They're probably in that book. But we had.
But as you traveled through,
there was a lot of heavy fighting all the time.
Because there were still Germans in all of those.
Yeah, and somebody you drive into some place and the Germans were completely shocked that you were there. But the German army was a good army, so they got the most out of their people. I don't think there's any question about that. Yeah, you know, I never forget one night we were driving on. We stopped on this road, and I was sitting there, and I got to looking. It got light enough I could see, and I could see somebody's laying in that ditch. So I get out and went over there, and it was this really young German soldier, and he surrendered. So I got him out, and we didn't know what to do with him. So we just took him into the half track, and he's sitting next to me, and I talked to him because he could speak. I'm very good at picking up a working knowledge of a language, and he knew some English, so we talked. And I remember I asked him. I said, "Looks like Hitler's losing the war." You know, I said, "We're going for." Oh, he said, "Don't worry, Hitler will find a way." He believed that the Germans would win. And I said, "Don't look to me like they're doing too good." You know, I mean, I treated them very good, and then eventually we saw a military police unit and turned them over, and I'm sure they took him to. He might have ended up in the U.S. They brought a lot of German prisoners to the U.S. But anyway, I thought it was a good experience because you saw this kid he just didn't know what to do, but he still thought the Germans would win.
Wow. Do you recall any other memorable experiences like that along the way?
Yeah, not particularly. I forget. You know, one of the things I remember extremely well is this was later. It was getting cold. It was a cold night, and a very cold rain was falling, and we stopped on the road. They never told you when you're going to go on or when you're going to stop, and we were stopped right in front of a funeral home. And you know, it was raining like hell, and the half track's open. So I went over and looked in that place, and there was a whole bunch of caskets, and there was a one casket unoccupied, but right next to it was one with a dead German guy in it, all dressed in a suit and all. So I said, so I slept in that casket and slept good because it was warm.
Wow.
But you know, you got very used to seeing. Now, when I saw a dead American soldier, it bothered me. But the dead Germans didn't bother me at all.
So you slept right next to that?
I mean, it gave you a different feeling when you looked at the dead German than if it was a dead American. I don't know why, that's the way it is.
So what did you do once you got to the Siegfried line?
Well, first when we stopped there because we had to wait for some gas and stuff to come up, and we stayed in the pillbox because if you got artillery or something, you're safe in there. But it wasn't very long until we drove right straight on, and we drove into Germany, and we advanced pretty rapidly up to the Rhine. We were on the hills overlooking the Rhine River Valley. You could see the first big town that's right on the Rhine River. And but we stayed there for a long time. We stayed away from that. We stayed on those. In fact, they didn't know when they're going to drive on. So where we stopped was right next to a German house, and the Germans were all gone. So we actually lived in that house for a while we were waiting. They never told you what's going to happen. And then all of a sudden one night, the order came out, be ready to move at daylight. And we turned around and went back to Liège, Belgium, which we had taken a long time before. As soon as we got to Liège, it's a big city. We set up a perimeter around Liège because that's when the Germans had made that what they call it, the breakthrough that they made into and they had what they call the Battle of the Bulge. So, but we set up.
You were at the Battle of the Bulge, correct?
Well, what we did, we first we were around Liège because they wanted to make sure the Germans didn't take Liège. They didn't know exactly where they were going because Liège had become a big supply point. Trains all brought the stuff into Liège, so they wanted us
So
to.
when you
And then
got,
as soon as the
when you
weather,
got to Liège, were there Germans there yet or
no, they hadn't reached there yet. We just set up. We wanted to make sure they didn't take it because it had become a big supply point for the U.S. Army.
Now, earlier you told me a story about Liège when you got there.
Yeah, because this was it when we first got there. When we on the way in, we drove up to the edge of Liège in the evening. It was getting late, not dark yet, and we stopped there. And then they said, "Well, you're going to stay here overnight. Go ahead and dig in." So we started, and the city of Liège started right across the road. There was a road around it. Then all of a sudden, all the people came running out of Liège, and this bunch of girls ran up to our position. And this one young girl grabbed the shovel out of my hand, started digging like crazy, and because they were so glad to see us. Because I mean, you talk about people who hated the Germans. The Belgians really hate the Germans because Germans goose-stepped across their country. No telling how many times in history. So then it started getting dark, and they had told us, "Don't not leave your position under any circumstances." But these girls started asking us to go to their house, and they said, "It's right there. Our house is right over there." They wanted us to go over there and have dinner with them. Well, we went, and I forget how many of us there were. Probably from my half-trade, probably 7 or 8 guys. We went over there. And they had
left your post and went over and had dinner with the girls?
Yeah, no, and their whole family was there, mother, father. So we had a nice dinner. They had a nice house, and it was one of the most pleasant evenings I ever spent in my life. Because it was like being at home. Because I'm still just a kid. And, it was like being at home. You see the mother, the father, all the kids, everybody very hospitable, and they had a good dinner for us. And I remember one of the girls asked me to look out the back door, and there was blood all over the back porch. And she said a German had gotten shot and killed right there on that porch, and there was blood there. And she said they had 2 or 3 cats, and she said the cats ran up and started drinking the German's blood, and she roared with laughter. They really hated the German.
Who shot the German on their back porch?
I don't know. Probably some of our people, I suppose, because there was fighting went on early. I'm not sure about that.
So they must have been
somebody on our side anyway. But I don't. There was a lot of shooting going on.
So then, after you had that nice evening in Liège, you went back to your post?
Well, the next day, then we attacked. In the morning, we crossed into Liège. But by that time, the Germans had decided to pull out of Liège. Well, we didn't know that, but they had. So we drove in and started driving down one of the main streets, and the people of Liège all collected along that street. So it was like a victory parade. I mean, I've never seen anything like it. They were cheering us, and people were running up and throwing things in the half track, like bottles of wine and food of all kinds. But I remember I was up by the radio there where you could look down, and all of a sudden I see this package on the radio, and it was ice cream. And it was beginning to melt a little bit, so you'd see, right? And then one of the most things I've never forgotten, we were stopped there, and this little old lady came up, and she handed me a Joan of Arc medal, silver Joan of Arc medal, and she said in English, "This will get you home safely to your mama." I never forget that. It was such a memorable experience.
Did you save that medal?
Oh, yeah.
You still have it?
I'm not sure where it is, but I've got it. Oh, yeah, I kept it. But, she was very sincere. And, she could tell I'm just a kid.
Wow.
So, I'm sure she was thinking about it. He's got a mama somewhere.
Yeah.
It's worried about him.
She was probably a mama herself.
Yeah.
Where did you go after Liège? After you went through Liège?
Oh, we drove all the way to the Elbe River where we met the Russians.
How did you participate in the Battle of the Bulge?
Well, what happened when the Battle of the Bulge came out, we were already at the town of Stolberg. And when the Germans attacked, and they picked the time because it was really bad weather, none of the airplanes could fly. So, I mean, we didn't know, we were waiting. We thought we were going to be attacking to the Rhine River and crossing the Rhine River there. But they told us to be ready to move out at dawn. And we drove straight back to Liège and set up a perimeter around Liège because Liège had become a big supply point for the whole area. So they wanted to make sure the Germans didn't take that. And we waited there for a couple of days until the weather cleared and they could find out then exactly where the Germans were. And then we took off and drove down into the Battle of the Bulge.
And was there fighting going on?
Oh
there?
yeah, all the way. And when you got down there, General Patton had come up from the south. He was south, and we'd come down from the north. So we all met there and took the area, and the Germans took off.
So at the Battle of the Bulge, your unit being a mortar unit, what did you guys have to do, and how did you set up your mortar?
Oh no, we always stayed. When an armored unit is driving somewhere going, you always have in the lead you have 2 tanks, and the next vehicle behind those 2 tanks is a mortar half track, because the mortar's job then is to, if an enemy tank or any tank gun opens up on those first 2 tanks, is you want to drop a smoke round.
So all along, when you're driving along with those tanks, and that's what you were doing, that's what you're
you're watching for it. Yeah, you're watching to see if they get shot at by an anti-tank gun from somewhere. And the first thing you got to do is try to see exactly where that shot's come from, what area, and you always keep track of which way the wind is blowing. So if the shot comes from here, and you're over here, then you drop a smoke round here, and it goes right across and blinds them, so they can't.
Now, when you see that happening, is your unit supposed to act automatically when you see it, or do you have to wait for communication for somebody to tell you to fire that?
We pretty much act automatically.
And you were trained enough to see that if they were fired on, you knew exactly what you had to do and what.
Well, you know what you're advancing. You know that the Germans are going to eventually shoot at you, and what you want to do is to keep your lead tanks from getting knocked out. So you lay the smoke around to blind enemy when you see where the enemy is shooting from. And you might get an order to fire. You might just go ahead and do it. And what you need, we survived. We never lost anybody in my half track because we were extremely smart. We learned so much. That what you always want to do when the column stops, you don't know when you're going to get shot at, is you always make sure you get behind something. Because a mortar is a high trajectory. You can fire over trees, houses, and if you're behind something like that, they can't shoot at you. That's why you survive. But you can still get that round off and do exactly your job. But you do it without getting killed.
Would you say that most of the mortars that you fired across Germany were smoke rounds?
More than high explosive. You had high explosive because that's how you protected the tanks. By laying a smoke screen so
really your job was as much to protect the tanks as to be the aggressor.
Yeah.
And
if you fired high explosive, you're usually firing at German infantry. Most of the time, we use more smoke than anything else.
Well, after the Battle of the Bulge, and you continued to cross Germany, you had enough supplies and fuel at that point to make it all the way to the Elbe River?
Oh no, they dropped a lot of, and you had
along the way they continued to drop.
And you had a constant flow of trucks that were coming all the way from the Normandy beach. Because all the stuff that went into Germany, the whole war, was unloaded on Normandy Beach and put on other trucks that took it in. And I think if you look at the whole history of the World War II, it was such a big operation, but General Eisenhower was a real master of planning. He's the guy. I mean, the most important single guy for us winning that war, I think, was probably him and his ability to plan operations. There's a movie out now about Eisenhower. I watched it the other night, and it's pretty good. That's pretty well told in there.
Now, when you got to the Elbe River, what did your unit do?
Well, when we came to the Elbe River, they had, of course, when we first came near the Elbe River, they had captured a railroad bridge across the Elbe that had not, I mean, it was still possible to go over that railroad bridge, but it was also obvious that that bridge was greatly weakened by bombing and shelling. So they decided to put up a pontoon bridge just south of the big bridge. So when we crossed on that pontoon bridge and right into the city. And we were having a lot of fights with the tanks and anti-tank guns right around the Capitol building. What's the town right across the Rhine River there? I know it as well as my own name.
So
it'll be on that map where you cross the Rhine River.
The Rhine or the Elbe?
The Rhine. It's sort of almost like the border between Belgium and Germany, but it's all German. Anyway, that's all right.
Right.
It was always the fact that you were right behind the German. See, their main idea was to try to get to the Seaford line and set up a defense there so you couldn't get into Germany. But we basically outmaneuvered them.
So actually, I see the map of all the towns and battles that you went through with your unit, and I know that there was fighting at Cologne. Your unit was involved in that battle.
Yeah.
And what was that like?
Well, it was just a usual battle. You had the German tanks and our tanks just.
And you just fought it out.
Just fought it out. Infantry and we fired a lot of our mortars, especially smoke, trying to blind the German tanks. Because the German, they're one of the big things about the war is the German had a much better tank than we had. Our tanks were greatly inferior. And, they couldn't, and because they had this tremendous gun on them. And our guns, we eventually got better guns on the tanks, but they were never that good. I mean, I'll never forget one day we were in this town, I don't remember exactly where it was, and there was a German tank sitting down right in the middle of the street. And as you came down the road, he knocked out one or two of our tanks. And then we got behind this building. And there was one of our tanks was right there. And what he would do, he would turn our tank would turn his gun. Then he'd just pull out slowly so he could turn until he could see the German tank. Then he'd shoot at it. And you could see the shell just bounced right off of the German tank. Then he'd pull back, see, right? The German tank just sat in the middle of the street like, what are you guys trying to do? And he finally cranked his gun around and fired a shot that went through both walls of that building and through the tank. through our tank. I mean, they had us outgunned with no question. And that's and they were always, we've eventually got some tanks with better guns, but never one as good as what they. I think the last tank, because we only got 2 of them, and it was almost the end of the war already. It's called the Abrams. I think they called it the Abrams, and it became the #1 tank in the U.S. arsenal after the war was over. But it had a big gun that would penetrate all that stuff. But you just barely got them. The war basically was already over.
Now, when you got to the Elbe River and you crossed the river on the pontoon bridge, you couldn't go any further, is that correct? Because we were going to let the Russians take Berlin?
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah, the Russians, we were right across the river from the
Did you
Germans.
have to wait for the Russians to arrive?
I don't remember exactly. When we got up to the river, we just waited there, and then pretty soon we saw the Russians were there. And they weren't the least bit friendly to the U.S.
No.
Now, you could tell. I mean, I made the statement in front of all the people in my unit there that what we ought to do is cross the river and just keep driving into Germany. I mean, into Russia. We're going to fight them. We'll fight them one of these days. And now we got the greatest army the world has ever seen. We have.
You knew that even as a young boy
yeah.
at that time.
And I said, because we have the greatest army that's ever existed in the world. We got the strength. We can drive right through Russia.
What made you know that Russia was going to be our next war?
Because you could tell the Russians didn't like us at all. They were very unfriendly. I mean, and if you studied the history of Russia and all, I mean, I didn't think there's no question they wanted to. I mean, see that the Russians that controlled Russia at that time. I mean, they'd made up their mind that they were going to dominate the whole world. All right, they got along with us at that time because they needed us pretty badly. But that's the only reason. And they were always unfriendly as hell. So I mean, it was obvious. So, and I believed that we would end up fighting them someday. But then, the war ended.
Where were you when the war ended in Europe?
Germany.
Do you remember,
that's where we were sitting right there on the Elbe River.
Do you remember when you actually heard the news?
Maybe it was been right there. We heard that the Germans had surrendered, and Hitler was dead. The Germans had surrendered, and then we stayed in Germany for quite a long time, because the 3rd Armored Division was scheduled to go to the Pacific and be involved in the invasion of Japan.
Where in Germany did you stay?
See, we stayed near. We moved to 2 or 3 different places. First place we stayed was Klein-Umstadt. It was a little town right by the railroad station, and our job was to guard There was a railroad engine sitting right in the station, and our job was to. And I think they'd had some cars that had some valuable supplies or something on it, so we were supposed to keep people from getting the supplies off of that thing. So we stayed right there, and then eventually we moved to Darmstadt, and we stayed. And we moved up into the mountains. Beautiful country around. I forget what the nearest town was. We didn't go to town anyway, but we stayed in those mountains were really a beautiful place, and we stayed. And what the U.S. Army did is they just commandeered houses. So we stayed in this nice house, my unit. And I remember the lady who owned the house, she came every day and cleaned the house, and she watched everything. If we did something to hurt the house, she'd really get mad, you know.
And she was a German lady?
Yeah.
So did you take good care of her?
But she came and checked it, and she cleaned it, did everything. So, you know, she wasn't bad. She was pretty friendly. But you could, I mean, that's what she was doing, is protecting the house. She didn't want us to damage her. And it was a nice house, big. And we stayed there, you know, I think pretty much for the rest of the war. But then eventually, you know, when we had driven from Normandy, we passed to the south of Paris. You could see the Eiffel Tower. And I always wanted to go to Paris. Because, you know, when I was a kid, high school, I read all these Ernest Hemingway books. I loved Ernest Hemingway. And, you know, he loved Paris. So you read those books, he always talks about what a wonderful city Paris is, right? So all of a sudden I see on a bulletin board, and it said, if anybody wants to go to Paris, you know, please talk to us right over here. So we went and talked. And I had this other guy, and nobody else wanted to go, but he thought he would like to go, so we went and talked to him. And they said, all right, because we could ride the train to Paris free. And they had, the Red Cross had taken over these little hotels in Paris. And you could stay free in those little hotels, and you could eat there also, no charge, run by the Red Cross. But we didn't really have any money because the Army hadn't even paid us for a long time. They always did that. The Army never kept up. So most of the time you didn't really have any money. They owed you money, but you didn't have it. So, but what we did is in my half track, I think we had 7 people. And of the 7, I think only 2 of them smoked. But they gave, every soldier in combat got a carton of cigarettes a week. So we got all these cigarettes, and with the half track had many compartments and places where you could put the cigarettes.
So you had stashed all
So we had
cigarettes.
stashed them in the half track. And so when it came up, we didn't have any money, but we knew that on the black market in Paris, they were giving so much a carton for American cigarettes. We knew the exact price. So each one of us took this, what they call a musette bag. It's a canvas bag about like that. But anyway, you could put 20 cartons of cigarettes in that bag. So each one took the bag with 20 cigarettes, 20 cartons, went to Paris, and of course we went into this little hotel. And then then it was time for us to figure out what we're going to do selling the cigarettes. Fine. So I walked out by myself in front of the hotel, and this really seedy looking little Frenchman sidled up to me and said, "Cigarette?" I said, "Yes." So he said, "Follow me." So I followed him, and he kept walking and walking and going into more seedy looking areas. So I began to think, is this guy going to try to knock me in the head and take my cigarettes or what? So then he finally stopped at what was like it had several rooms, and they had tables in each room, and it was more or less like a bar, but it was scattered out all over, see. So he went into this room and sat down behind the table and had me sit beside him, but we were behind this table, and then put the cigarettes between us there, counted them out, and then he paid me exactly what I knew what the price was supposed to be. He paid me, and then he ordered these 2 little shot glasses full of some kind of clear liquor. And he wanted to drink a toast, right? But I wouldn't drink mine. And he knew, because I was worried that he had something in there that would knock me out and he'd take my money, see? And he knew exactly what I was thinking. He was an older guy, so he drank his down, and then he picked mine up and drank it and laughed. He wasn't mad at all, but he knew exactly what I was thinking. He was very friendly.
So you took your money and saw France.
Okay, then I had, yeah. And then Paris is full of all kind of museums and everything. And I loved those sidewalk cafes, good food, and we spent a lot of time. The Red Cross had taken over. You know, if you go up the Eiffel Tower, about halfway up, there's a place where they have food, everything, and they have really good French food up there. So you could go up there, and it was a wonderful menu and everything on everything, because then we had enough money to pay for it. And I think the Red Cross had taken over that restaurant area, so it was run very honestly, and you got really good. But the French were doing all the cooking and everything. So we really had, and then we went. You know, there's no city in the world that has more museums than Paris does. So we went to that, and we'd sit in the sidewalk cafes and just had, you know. And
so how long did you get to stay in Paris?
At least a week.
Oh, wow.
You know, and the hotel, that little hotel we stayed in, was run by a lady who was a French lady, but she worked for the American Red Cross, and she ran. And I spent a lot of time talking to her. She liked me, because, you know, I'm just a kid. She probably had a son about my age, maybe, but she was very nice to me, and I enjoyed talking to her because her English was good. Because that's why they hired her, I'm sure.
Right. And then you went back to your unit, and you thought you were preparing for the invasion of Japan. When do you recall when you heard about?
No, when we were in Paris, the Japanese surrendered. So I knew the war was going to be over when we went back. But we were sitting in a sidewalk cafe, and this kid came around selling newspapers. And, you know, I was pretty good at picking up a working knowledge of whatever the local language was. And he was screaming, selling those papers about the dropping the atomic bomb. So that was when they had dropped the atomic bomb. And, you know, almost immediately Japan surrendered. So,
you were actually in Paris enjoying yourself when the atomic bomb was dropped.
And then you knew the war was over.
Oh.
And so then we went
back. What were the streets of Paris like when that news hit?
Well, everybody seemed to be pretty happy about it. I didn't see no big change, but everybody seemed to be, because everybody knew then, and I think the French they really wanted the war to be over. They were really tired of that, the ordinary people.
So then you knew the war would be over. Then once you returned to your unit, how long before you could go back home?
It was a while. I don't remember, because, you know, then you had to figure out how are they going to get all those troops back to the U.S. You know, that's because you had so many in Germany. So what we did, when we finally left, we went by train to Marseille, you know, and that's where we caught a ship and went out through the, you know, what's the big strait there with the statue, because you're on the Mediterranean Ocean. Then we sailed through that and went out in the Atlantic and went across. But we got on the ship down there.
The ship to come home across. Do you remember which ship it was?
I don't remember the name of it, but what they were, this was much better than the trip over, because we were on a British ship. It was a British liner, but they weren't set up to handle that many people. So going over there, no matter how cold it was, we spent every other night on the deck. And, you know, a lot of freezing rain and all that sort of thing. But you had to sleep because they didn't have no room inside.
So what'd you do, take turns?
Yeah, the units, you'd go up with your platoon, and we had these what they call shelter halves and blanket, so you could cover up with the shelter half and not get wet. But it was pretty uncomfortable. But you had to spend every third night. That's right, every third night you had to sleep on deck because there just wasn't enough room. And where we slept inside, it was in the swimming pool where I always slept, and they had stacked. The beds were 5 high, one right against the other, you know, stacks of beds. And you just had too many people on that. It was an ocean liner, not a big one, but it used to run between Southampton and the southern South Africa. But it was a nice liner, but it just wasn't set up to handle people like that. And like the food, when the first thing you got up in the morning, first thing you did is get in the line to have breakfast, right? And it took hours. So then, and by the time you finish breakfast, you get right back and get in line and they only serve 2 meals. And then you'd finally get in the afternoon, you'd get the next meal. So you spent the whole day waiting in the food line.
And that was the trip over?
Yeah, because they just didn't have any room.
Wow. Well, at this point, let me ask.
But when you went back, it was a regular troop ship set up to handle troops. So you had good food, you had plenty of it, very comfortable, but it was built as a troop ship.
Let me ask you a little bit about the daily life and the living conditions. This whole time that you were overseas, how did you stay in touch with your family back home in the United States?
Write a letter, that's all there was. There was no other way.
Did you have regular mail service even when you were?
I mean, I don't know how regular it was, but if a mail, every once in a while you'd get a letter. I've still got some of the letters somewhere. Because the only one I ever wrote to was my mother. Because I didn't like to write letters anyway. But I knew I had to write letters with her. Because, I was the only son, and her big hopes for whatever I would do, anybody in the family would do, she thought it was going to be me. I mean, I was the apple of her eye. And my 2 sisters didn't resent that. Because we got along really well anyway. And but Mom was with the big hopes that I was going to be the guy who would be successful and do everything. And it all turned out that way, because then when I went to Thailand and spent all those years, she made at least 2 visits to Thailand, pretty lengthy visits. She got along really well with my wife's family. When I eventually got married, but even before I got married, they would always take care of my mother. Because I knew, actually the guy I worked with, Sid Suetzela, Sid was my wife's elder brother. I think he's still alive. I can't get, all the people I always got my information from all died on me. But I think Sid's still alive. But he was here when World War II started, going to a university. He went to MIT. In fact, he was later declared as a distinguished student. No, distinguished student from MIT. And after he became the big man in Thailand, he used the MIT to, for example, I remember this one team from MIT came and set up all the red lights in Bangkok. It's a huge city, so that it would handle the best traffic pattern. They sent people from MIT to study the whole thing and set it up. And he was declared as a distinguished student at MIT. And he was a very smart guy.
When you were fighting your way across France and Germany, what was the food like? What did you guys do for food?
All right, when we first landed, you had 2 kinds of rations. You had one called K ration, and K ration was just little tins with some meat dish in them, and you had crackers, and you could carry a little package that was enough for a meal. So 3 of those little packages would take care of you for the day, right? But that was what we landed with. But then they came out with other rations that got it got better. See, what was the next? But anyway, we ended up getting what they call the 10-in-1 rations, and they were really good. What it was is of course, we being in the half tracks or tanks, that made it a little bit easier about the food, because what you do is you got a box. It was about this by this by this. And 10-in-1 mean rations for 10 men for 1 day. And it had some really good stuff in it. It was like you had milk in cans, but fresh milk. So you'd have cereal, for example. You'd have it was pretty good food in those 10-in-1 rations. All right, you still had the kitchen, the company. We had a kitchen, but the trouble is the kitchen couldn't stay up with the combat troops all the time. So but see, Eisenhower declared that every combat soldier will get one hot meal a day. No, it's going to be then you're going to get them a hot meal a day. Okay, usually the hot meal came about 3 o'clock in the morning, because whenever else the cook's they had to come up with their truck and serve, and you're right up, you're right on the front line. So that's about the only time they could do it with any degree of safety. And they pretty well served the same thing every time. It was a breakfast with pancakes and Vienna sausage. But the Army made really good pancakes.
So that was considered your one hot meal?
That's
and then
it.
you had rations? So
well, if you got someplace where there was no fighting going on for a while, then you'd get regular hot meals.
They would set up.
The kitchen could work out of a 2.5-ton truck, or if you had a temporary building they could use, a tent, they could set up tents. But there's no question they did a good job of, under all circumstances, the food wasn't that bad.
Did you always have enough of the other supplies, ammunition, clothing, that kind of thing?
Yeah, clothing. When we landed in Normandy, we wore the same, I wore the same clothes for 30 days. And like at night I could take off my pants and just stand them up in the corner. And they made you wear the wool uniform, because the Germans said they would not recognize the fatigue cotton uniform as a uniform. It had to be that wool. You had wool shirt and trousers. So, but Europe is very cool. You didn't really suffer from being too hot much, because Europe is cold. I mean, I spent, and it still is. We went up to Belgium and all that, and that other trip. I mean, it's cool every night. It's cold. So it wasn't that bad.
So that 30
but then what they had was what they call shower units. They would come in and set up these tents, and they'd have the hot showers in those tents, big tents.
How often did you get a hot shower?
I don't know, but whenever they could get to it, a shower unit would come up and set up. And so what you did when you went in one end, you threw your clothes in a pile, took everything out of the pockets and left them with your vehicle, right? Then you threw them out, and when you came out the other end, they had
clean
clothes laying there. You could pick out your size and put them on, and then you were clean.
Did you feel pressure or stress?
No, I never did. I mean, yeah, any day you could have got killed something, but I never worried about it. But I never did. I don't know why. Everything I ever went through. That's why today people talk about all this, people having stress. I don't even know what the hell stress is.
Well, that was a good thing. Was there anything special that you did for good luck?
Well, if you got in a hole and the shells were popping all over you, you didn't know if you were going to live for the next 5 minutes. I prayed a little bit. Everybody does, no matter who they are, I guarantee you.
What did you do for entertainment when you weren't in battle?
Well, I always read a lot, because I knew I was going back to college. And, I was majoring in engineering. Engineering is a hard course. So I knew that
you were out in the field reading engineer books.
But I was reading books that I thought would keep my mind in good shape when I went back to college. Well, that can be any good book. I mean, so I didn't read comic books. You know what I mean? Yeah. If you read serious books, it exercises your mind. So I always had at least 2 books in my pack. So anytime we weren't doing anything, I would read. I like to read, but I think it helped me so, because when I got back here and went back to college, it seemed to me like I'd forgot everything I ever knew. And I was really worried that I would flunk out, because engineering is a tough course. I mean, it's a really tough course. There's no question about it. That's why today, I go to A&M every once in a while, I'm invited by the engineering department, and they tell me that the only people at A&M who major in engineering now are almost entirely Chinese and Indians. Americans don't take it because it's too hard.
Wow. Did you ever have any leave when you were overseas, other than your trip to Paris?
Yeah, that's all. I mean, where would you go? There was no place to go.
Did you keep a journal or a diary at all?
No. But my memory's really good.
What did you think of your fellow soldiers and the officers?
I mean, the big thing about it, in my unit, the people who rode in my half track were the best people I've ever known in my life. We did not stay in touch with each other. I thought we would never be out of touch because we were in danger all the time, and we trusted, we had confidence in everybody doing their job. That's what's going to keep you alive. But we didn't really. The only one I saw is the guy he was in my unit, and he was a good guy, a really good friend. And I got a call here one day from this guy who said that my father he lives now in Arizona, and he's coming to visit me, and he wants to see you because he says that you saved his life. And it was this guy who was a good friend, you know.
Did you get to see him?
Yeah, well, when he got here, they gave me a telephone number, so I called him, and then I went up and spent the day with him in Dallas.
Do you recall his name?
I know it as well as my own, but it don't come to me. So what was his name?
Is he one of the?
I have it.
Is he one of the guys in that photograph?
Yeah.
Okay, and we'll attach a photograph of Bill's.
And I'll come up with the names.
Okay.
But he came to Dallas, and I went up, and we spent the whole day together.
When did you save his life?
I say, I didn't believe I had saved his life. I believed I'd probably screwed up, you know. So, but what happened was, as this was right into Normandy. After we landed, we were still in those hedgerow things, and we stopped in this hedgerow field overnight. And when we stopped, then we parked on the edges, but they told us that everybody to dig in the middle of the field. So you sleep in a slit trench in case, because you may get artillery and all. So we all dug in there, and I was on guard. So all of a sudden, a tank outfit that wasn't our unit, it all was parked on that side along the hedgerow. And sometime during the night, they decided to pull out. I'm sure they got an order to go somewhere or do something. So they cranked up the tanks, and they drove across around the edge, you know, along the hedgerow, and went out the gate. And I was watching them go out, and all of a sudden, I was out in the middle of the field, and my group of people were all dug in right out there. And all of a sudden, I looked around, and there's a tank. His outfit had left, but he couldn't get his tank started, and he finally got started, and he came right across the middle of the field. But I was watching those other tanks, so I didn't hear him until I turned around, and he's right on top of this hedgerow of one of my people, the one who I went to see up in Dallas. That's why he told him that I'd saved his life. And I thought I screwed up because I should have seen that tank ahead of time. But see, when that happened, they were getting right at his slip ring. So I ran and jumped up on the side and started pounding on the driver's helmet, yelling at him to stop. And then he stopped. He was right at that slit ring. And John suddenly jumped up out of that ditch.
And the tank was right there.
The tank was right on him.
Good thing the tank
But
burned you.
But then when John told the story later years, I'd saved his life because I'd stopped that tank from driving over him, right?
Yes.
But I felt that I had screwed up by getting in that position in the first place for not watching more carefully. But anyway, I'll never forget that because they were right on top of him. And then he jumped up out of that hole and was looking right at the tank. And the ground was soft, so if it had gone over him, I think it'd have killed him.
Oh, I'm sure. Do you recall when you came back to the United States? Where did your ship dock when you came back?
Boston?
So when you got into Boston, were you immediately discharged?
No. We got to Boston and they moved us into a military camp. I don't know exactly where it was.
Uh-huh.
And then when we got into the military camp, we'd only been there a day or two. Then they put us on a train, and we came all the way to Texas.
On the train?
Yeah, and then we stopped in Austin or someplace down there, and then I got on a bus and came to Waco. That's where my mother was living.
What did you do in the days immediately after your discharge when you returned to Waco?
Oh, I don't remember exactly, but not long. When I landed, and it was when I finally got home, it was pretty much the beginning of the football season. So my mother knew she liked the football and I did. So she arranged with a lady friend of hers and the husband, because Texas University was playing Texas A&M at Austin, and that's the biggest game of the year, no matter what year it is. And so we drove down and went to the ball game.
And then did you go right back to college after that on the GI Bill?
By the time I got out of the Army and all, it was probably within 2 weeks. I was back at A&M.
And did you get your degree from Texas A&M?
Yeah.
What was your degree in?
It was in engineering. It was actually in geological engineering.
Geological engineering?
Yeah. Which means it's a kind of a cross between petroleum engineering and geology. So you can work you can either work with the oil rig that's getting the oil out of the ground, or you can be the...
Because your intention was to go to work in the oil business, because your family had done that in the past.
Well, and at that time, the big place where they were drilling new wells was in South America.
So you thought maybe
I figured I'd be going, and that's why I studied Spanish in college, because I thought that's probably where I'd end up. But it didn't happen.
Did you maintain any of the friendships you formed during World War II? Except for that one guy when you had that Lair?
Not really.
Have you gone to any of their reunions?
I went to let me see, what reunions? I don't think I went to the big, but see, Waco had a chapter of the Third Armored Division Association. So we had a lot of reunions at Waco. And we usually had a monthly get-together in Waco. And I just got a thing from the Third Armored Division Association. I'm a member. I became a lifetime member. And they're getting ready to have what will be the last reunion. They said this will be the end of the reunion. And they're going to have it in Georgia.
Are you gonna go?
I would like to, but I haven't really made up my mind fully to go or not. I think I probably ought to. I know I've never seen anybody I know, but it still would be a good place to go. I may go.
Did you join any veterans organizations?
Well, you know, we had the Third Armored Division Association. We had we always had about a monthly meeting in Waco, just the people around that lived around this area. It was just a fun thing. We always had the meeting and then we ate together, and that's about it.
Did your military experience in World War II influence your thinking about war or about the military in general?
Well, yeah, I think it had some influence anyway. Because I mean, the U.S. remained all these years a free country, mainly because everybody else was afraid to do anything to us, because we could protect ourselves. And I think that still needs to be. But we treat I think there's no country in the world that's treated the foreign countries as well as we have. We help them when they really get in trouble. But at the same time, we keep their respect because we will kick the devil out of them if they don't. And I think in foreign affairs, that's what you have to do. Because if you remember, who was it? Teddy Roosevelt said in foreign affairs, walk softly and carry a big stick. And Teddy was right.
Bill, did you earn any medals or citations during World War II?
I got a few medals over there. Not any, no really big thing. Because, but the trouble is, if you understand the medal problems in the war, especially in World War II, because, we hadn't been in many wars. It's World War One. So once we got into combat, there were guys doing brave things every damn day, but nobody got any medals. So all of a sudden an order came out from division headquarters saying, we want you to start writing up when somebody does something because we need to give out medals. We know people have earned them, but we haven't given them because nobody has written it up. So then, so I mean, that was because you're too busy fighting the war to worry about writing people up for medals. So I think medals are good, but for guys who get the big medals, it's got to be some unusual thing. But there are guys that's doing things that probably deserve a medal every day, but it just don't go that way. But the ones who actually end up getting the medals, they're probably done something really unusual, in which they had to show a great disregard for their own safety. But I remember when the order came out, we'd already been in combat for over a month, and they said, we got to give out a few medals. Because we're getting nasty letters from headquarters.
Bill, how would you say that your service in World War II affected your life?
Well, I believe it made me an awful lot better person. Because in the first place, it made you know that you could actually do something really dangerous without getting scared out of your wits. You know what I mean? And I think that's true. And I think you need to be able to do that, especially if you work for the CIA. Where I went. They sent me to Asia and said, teach them how to fight guerrilla warfare, and we did that, and we fought a lot of guerrilla warfare.
Actually, the next part of your interview is going to deal with your career after World War II and actually how your experience in World War II affected that career, which was you never actually became a geological engineer. You became a CIA case officer during the Vietnam era. So a lot of what you've told me now about World War II and your military experience affected your future career.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, because it trained me not only of how you do yourself under very stressful conditions, but how it affects other people and how can you train people to still be able to do their duty when their life is in great danger. And that is what I did in Southeast Asia. So, there's no question that my World War II experience and my education and everything all affected the whole thing.
Bill, is there anything else about your World War II experience that you'd like to add that I haven't asked you about? Any other memorable experiences or incidents that you haven't shared that you would like to?
Well, one thing that I always remember is that at the end of the war when Roosevelt died, right? Roosevelt died. Roosevelt came to Europe. Came to Germany after the war had ended. Very short trip. He went back and he died shortly after that. And then when Truman became president, he came on a visit. And I remember very well seeing him, because he gathered a big group around him, made a speech and all that. But, if you looked at Truman, he's not the kind of guy you thought president should look like. He looked like a seedy little guy who sold dry goods, and that's actually what he was. But I believe that in the end, he turned out to be one of the best presidents we ever had. Because you look at what he did. He stuck his thumb right in the eye of the Russians and said, "You're not going to take over the world." And he sent our troops to fight them in North Korea. And it wasn't popular. He knew it wasn't popular. He knew it was going to get him in a lot of criticism, but he did it because he thought it was the right thing to do. And then when he left the presidency, he went straight back to his hometown. He lived in the same house. He had the same amount of money. He gained nothing materially from his being in the president. And to me, I think that makes him one of the best presidents we ever had. He's the first one who really stuck his thumb in the eye of the Russians. I think he was an actually good man.
Well, Bill, I'd like to thank you for your interview, and I'd like to thank you for your service.